Judge Wallace Harmon smirks as he slams his gavel, denying Eleanor Mitchell's desperate plea for her family home of 40 years, claiming insufficient evidence despite the clear documentation in her hands. The courtroom falls silent as a tall man rises from the back, badge glinting under fluorescent lights. "This proceeding is now under federal investigation," announces Special Agent Marcus Mitchell. Judge Harmon's face drains of color as he realizes the widow he just dismissed is the mother of one of the Bureau's most decorated agents. What will happen when justice and corruption collide? Before we dive into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you believe in the power of true justice, hit that like and subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode reveals a government conspiracy you won't believe exists in America today. Eleanor Mitchell had spent her entire life caring for others. At 60 years old, the retired nurse had dedicated 35 years to Westlake Community Hospital, where her gentle hands and warm smile brought comfort to countless patients. Now, just 6 months after burying her beloved husband Robert, a Vietnam veteran who had fought for a country that still didn't fully accept him, Eleanor faced a battle of her own. Their modest 2-story home in Oakwood Heights, a historically black neighborhood in Westlake City, represented their lifetime of hard work and sacrifice. Robert had insisted on paying off the mortgage early, celebrating with champagne 5 years ago when they made the final payment. "This is our legacy, Ellie," he had said, "something no one can ever take away from us." But someone was trying to take it away. Oakwood Heights had become the target of aggressive gentrification. Pinnacle Properties, a development company, owned by Charles Winston, had been buying up homes throughout the neighborhood, demolishing the small family houses to build luxury condominiums that none of the original residents could afford. Winston, a tall, silver-haired man with cold eyes and a politician's smile, was a regular golf partner of Judge Wallace Harmon and a major donor to Mayor Franklin's campaigns. Eleanor first realized something was wrong when she received an official-looking letter claiming her mortgage had been sold to Pinnacle Properties. The letter demanded monthly payments nearly triple what her original mortgage had been. Confused and concerned, Eleanor gathered her documentation and visited First National Bank, where she and Robert had faithfully made payments for 30 years before. Bank manager Thomas Keller, a young white man with an expensive suit and dismissive attitude, barely glanced at her paperwork. "Mrs. Mitchell, I understand this can be confusing for someone your age," he said with a condescending smile. "But the bank records show your mortgage was sold to Pinnacle. Perhaps your late husband handled these matters." When Eleanor insisted the mortgage had been paid in full, Keller suggested she was confused and recommended she consult with family before making accusations. Eleanor left the bank with tears of frustration burning in her eyes, clutching the folder containing the proof of their final payment. Determined to fight, Eleanor visited Community Legal Services, where she met Zoe Taylor, a passionate young attorney just 2 years out of law school. Zoe, with her bright eyes and fierce determination, listened carefully as Eleanor explained her situation. Unlike Keller, Zoe examined Eleanor's documentation thoroughly, her expression growing increasingly troubled. "Mrs. Mitchell, your paperwork is in perfect order. The mortgage was completely paid off. This transfer to Pinnacle Properties is fraudulent." Over the next 2 weeks, Zoe discovered a disturbing pattern. 23 elderly black homeowners in Oakwood Heights had received similar letters. All had paid off or nearly paid off homes. All were being pressured to make payments to Pinnacle or face eviction. With Zoe's help, Eleanor filed a lawsuit against Pinnacle Properties, challenging the fraudulent transfer and seeking an injunction to stop any eviction proceedings. It seemed like a victory when the court accepted the case. But that night, Eleanor received the first threatening phone call. "Drop the lawsuit or you'll regret it," said a muffled voice before hanging up. The next morning, she found her mailbox smashed, the words, "Know Your Place," spray-painted across her front steps. When she called the police, the officer who responded took minimal notes and suggested it was probably just neighborhood kids. He left without dusting for fingerprints or checking for security camera footage from nearby homes. Eleanor sat alone in her kitchen that evening, Robert's military photo watching over her from the wall, wondering if she had the strength to continue this fight. The neighborhood she had known for 4 decades was changing around her. Not just the buildings, but the very spirit of community that had sustained them through hard times. She wouldn't call Marcus. Her son had important work to do in Washington, dangerous undercover assignments that required his full attention. This was her battle to fight, and despite her fear, Eleanor Mitchell had never been one to back down. Marcus Mitchell was the kind of FBI agent that criminals feared and colleagues respected. At 38, he had already built a reputation within the Bureau as relentlessly effective, with an uncanny ability to infiltrate even the most guarded criminal operations. His current assignment in Washington, D.C. had him deep undercover investigating a network of white-collar criminals with connections to political power players. His weathered face, intense brown eyes, and the small scar along his jawline from a childhood accident gave him a naturally intimidating presence that served him well in his work. But to Eleanor, he would always be her little boy who collected fireflies in mason jars and wanted to be a superhero. It had been nearly 2 years since Marcus had been able to visit home. His undercover work meant limited contact with family, for their safety as much as his own. Their weekly phone calls were brief and carefully worded, with Eleanor never burdening him with her troubles. She was too proud and too protective for that. The break-in happened on a Tuesday night, while Eleanor was at her church prayer group. She returned to find her back door splintered open, drawers emptied onto the floor, and her filing cabinet ransacked. Most disturbing of all, the folder containing her mortgage documents and the paperwork for her lawsuit against Pinnacle Properties was missing. The responding officers took a report, but made it clear this wouldn't be a priority case. Property? Crime? One officer muttered to his partner, not quite quietly enough. Probably looking for prescription drugs. Zoe helped Eleanor install security cameras and reinforce her doors, using funds from the Legal Aid Society. "They're trying to intimidate you because you're fighting back," Zoe said, as she helped Eleanor clean up the mess. "This means we're on the right track." Together, they reconstructed the missing documentation, obtaining certified copies from the county records office. As word of Eleanor's lawsuit spread, other affected neighbors began to contact her. They started meeting weekly at the Oakwood Heights Community Center, sharing stories and strategies. Many had faced similar intimidation tactics. Mrs. Washington, who lived 3 doors down, had received dead rats in her mailbox. Mr. Johnson, a retired postal worker, had his car windows smashed the day after he filed his own complaint against Pinnacle. The community organized a protest outside Pinnacle Properties' downtown office, with 30 residents carrying signs reading, "Stop the Fraud" and "Homes Not Profits." Local news channel WLC7 covered the protest, but the story that aired was barely recognizable to those who had participated. The reporter described them as disgruntled residents disrupting business, and gave Charles Winston a full minute to explain how Pinnacle was revitalizing a deteriorating neighborhood. Winston, impeccably dressed and smoothly articulate, expressed concern about outside agitators stirring up trouble in what is simply a routine business matter. Marcus was wrapping up his case in Washington when he caught the news clip on a hotel television. He immediately recognized his mother among the protesters, though the camera quickly cut away from her. Despite her composed expression, Marcus knew the subtle signs of strain in the set of her shoulders and the tightness around her eyes. Something was wrong. He called her that evening, casually asking about the neighborhood and her health. "Everything's fine, baby," Eleanor assured him, her voice betraying nothing. "Just the usual changes around here, you know how it goes. When are you coming to visit? It's been too long." "Soon, Mum," Marcus promised, already planning his next move. "The case is almost wrapped up. Tell me more about these neighborhood changes." Eleanor downplayed the situation, mentioning only that some development company was buying properties. But in her carefully chosen words, Marcus heard what she wasn't saying. As soon as they hung up, he contacted his supervisor to request immediate leave. 3 days later, without telling Eleanor, he was on a flight to Westlake City. Have you ever wondered what lengths you would go to protect your family from injustice? Comment number 1, if you believe Marcus is right to investigate without telling. His mother, Or number 2 if you think he should have been honest about his concerns. Hit that like button if you've ever witnessed someone standing up against discrimination in your community, and subscribe to see more stories of courage in the face of overwhelming odds. What will Marcus discover when he begins digging into the corruption in his hometown? And how far will Pinnacle Properties go to silence those who stand in their way? Marcus arrived in Westlake City under the cover of night, checking into a motel on the outskirts of town rather than going straight to his mother's home. Years of undercover work had taught him the value of discretion. He needed to assess the situation before making his presence known even to Eleanor. The next morning, he drove a rental car to a coffee shop with a view of Pinnacle Properties' sleek downtown office, observing the comings and goings while appearing to work on his laptop. By noon, he had identified Charles Winston, matching the developer's face to online photos. The man exuded confidence as he stepped from his black Mercedes, flanked by 2 security personnel who scanned the surroundings with practiced efficiency. Marcus noted Winston's lunch meeting with 2 men whose faces he couldn't quite see from his vantage point, but whose expensive suits and authoritative postures suggested positions of power. That afternoon, Marcus reconnected with his childhood friend, Detective James Harris. They met at a fishing spot outside town, where they had spent countless teenage afternoons, ensuring privacy for their conversation. James had stayed in Westlake, joining the police force right out of college, driven by the same desire to protect his community that had led Marcus to the FBI. "Man, it's good to see you," James said, embracing Marcus before his expression turned serious. "But I'm guessing this isn't just a social call." Marcus confirmed his suspicions about the situation in Oakwood Heights. James's face darkened as he explained the department's internal dynamics. "Chief Reynolds has made it crystal clear that complaints from Oakwood Heights are to be treated as low priority," James revealed, checking over his shoulder despite the isolated location. "Any officer who pushes too hard gets assigned to the worst shifts or sent to direct traffic at construction sites. The message is clear." "How far up does this go?" Marcus asked. "All the way," James replied grimly. "Reynolds answers to Mayor Franklin, and Franklin plays golf with Winston and Judge Harmon every Wednesday at Westlake Country Club." Over the next 3 days, Marcus conducted his own investigation, carefully avoiding being seen in his mother's neighborhood. What he discovered was far worse than he had imagined. Pinnacle Properties had systematically targeted 28 elderly black homeowners throughout Oakwood Heights, all with substantial equity in their homes. The pattern was identical in each case: falsified documents showing mortgage transfers, followed by demands for inflated payments, and finally, eviction proceedings when payments weren't made. Most disturbing was the paper trail connecting Pinnacle to local officials. Judge Wallace Harmon had presided over 17 eviction cases against Oakwood Heights residents in the past year, ruling in Pinnacle's favor every time despite clear evidence of fraud. Police Chief Reynolds had diverted resources away from investigating reports of vandalism and threats in the neighborhood, and Mayor Franklin had fast-tracked zoning changes to allow for Pinnacle's planned luxury development. Marcus compiled his findings into an anonymous package that he delivered to Zoe Taylor's office, including documentation that would strengthen Eleanor's case. The young attorney was visibly excited when she called Eleanor the next day. "This changes everything," Zoe exclaimed. "Whoever sent this has given us exactly what we need to prove the pattern of fraud. We can expand the suit to include all affected homeowners as a class action." The victory was short-lived. That night, Zoe's office was broken into, her computer stolen and case files scattered across the floor. A note written in red marker was pinned to her desk: "Stop helping troublemakers, or you'll be in trouble yourself." The police response was predictably minimal, with officers suggesting it was just a random break-in, despite the targeted nature of the attack. Meanwhile, Marcus had begun surveillance on Winston and Judge Harmon. Using FBI techniques and equipment he wasn't technically authorized to deploy without official sanction, he photographed them meeting secretly with Mayor Franklin at an exclusive restaurant outside the city limits. Their body language and the precautions they took to avoid being seen together confirmed his suspicions about a coordinated conspiracy. The stress began to take a physical toll on Eleanor. After a community meeting where Charles Winston himself made a surprise appearance to address concerns, offering insulting buyout terms well below market value, Eleanor collapsed in her kitchen. Her neighbor found her and called an ambulance. At the hospital, doctors diagnosed dangerously high blood pressure and kept her overnight for observation. Marcus nearly broke his cover to visit her, but restrained himself when he learned Zoe was with her. His mother's health was now at stake, raising the urgency of his investigation. As Eleanor lay in her hospital bed, Marcus vowed that the people responsible would face justice, no matter how powerful they believed themselves to be. Eleanor's case against Pinnacle Properties was suddenly fast-tracked through the court system with suspicious speed. Most civil cases in Westlake County Court lingered on the docket for months before receiving a hearing date, but Eleanor's lawsuit was scheduled for a preliminary hearing just 2 weeks after her hospital stay. Even more troubling, the case was assigned to Judge Wallace Harmon, despite procedural rules that should have placed it with Judge Martinez, who was next in the rotation for civil cases. Zoe immediately filed a motion requesting Judge Harmon's recusal, citing his social and business connections to Charles Winston as clear conflicts of interest. The young attorney arrived at the recusal hearing with meticulous documentation of Judge Harmon's previous rulings in Pinnacle-related cases, demonstrating a pattern of bias that would be difficult for any objective observer to dismiss. Judge Harmon, a thin man with steel-gray hair and cold blue eyes, listened to Zoe's presentation with barely concealed disdain. When she finished, he leaned forward, removing his glasses to stare directly at her. "Ms. Taylor, your insinuations are not just unfounded but border on contempt of court," he said, his voice carrying the refined accent of old money. "My relationships outside this courtroom have no bearing on my judicial decisions. Your motion is denied, and I caution you against raising such spurious objections in the future if you wish to continue practicing law in my courtroom." The threat was unmistakable. Zoe glanced at Eleanor, who sat straight-backed and dignified despite her recent health scare, and made a decision. "For the record, Your Honor, we maintain our objection and reserve the right to raise this issue on appeal." Judge Harmon's eyes narrowed dangerously, but before he could respond, the courtroom doors opened. Representatives from the Westlake Civil Rights Coalition filed in, led by Reverend Calvin Turner, a respected community leader. They filled the visitor section, their presence a silent statement of support and scrutiny. Outside the courtroom, Marcus watched from a distance as Reverend Turner spoke to reporters about the coalition's decision to monitor the proceedings. His FBI supervisor had reluctantly agreed to let him investigate unofficially after Marcus shared redacted versions of his findings, careful to omit details that would reveal his personal connection to the case. "This isn't just about one woman's home," his supervisor had conceded. "If what you've found is accurate, it's systematic civil rights violations with government complicity. But Mitchell, you're walking a tightrope here. No official bureau involvement until you have irrefutable evidence." Marcus's investigation had yielded disturbing results. Judge Harmon had presided over 48 similar cases brought by black homeowners against various developers, including Pinnacle Properties. In every single case, he had ruled against the homeowners, often dismissing clear evidence and imposing punitive costs that drove several families into bankruptcy. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence, but Marcus needed more to trigger an official FBI investigation. He needed to follow the money, find the kickbacks that would prove corruption rather than merely suggest bias. His methodical work was interrupted by an urgent call from Zoe. Eleanor had received an eviction notice, delivered by sheriff's deputies, giving her just 72 hours to vacate her home of 40 years. The notice cited an emergency order signed by Judge Harmon, claiming immediate possession necessary to prevent property deterioration. "He's bypassing normal procedure," Zoe explained, her voice tight with anger. "This should be impossible. That before our case is even heard. It's like they're not even pretending to follow the law anymore." The community mobilized quickly. By nightfall, 30 neighbors had formed a human chain around Eleanor's house, singing hymns and civil rights anthems as local news cameras captured the scene. Marcus watched the coverage from his motel room, pride in his mother's community, mixing with fear for their safety. His concern proved warranted when police arrived the next morning in riot gear, citing unlawful assembly and threatening arrests. The standoff grew tense as officers advanced toward the peaceful protesters, batons ready. Only the timely arrival of news crews from the state capital prevented violence, the additional witnesses causing the police captain to order his officers to stand down temporarily. How would you react if your home was being stolen through a corrupt legal system? Comment number 1 if you would fight through the courts like Eleanor, number 2 if you would take more direct action like Marcus, or number 3 if you'd be among the neighbors forming that human chain of protection. If you believe our justice system should work equally for everyone regardless of race or wealth, hit that like button and subscribe to see more stories that expose the ongoing fight for true equality in America. What evidence will Marcus uncover about the money behind this conspiracy? And as the eviction deadline approaches, will Eleanor be forced from her home before justice can prevail? While Eleanor's community stood guard at her home, Marcus intensified his investigation, working 18-hour days to unravel the financial web connecting Pinnacle Properties to Judge Harmon and other city officials. Using FBI database access that he was stretching the limits of his authorization to employ, he traced a complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts designed to hide the flow of money. Pinnacle Properties, despite its local focus, maintained banking relationships in the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg. These accounts received regular transfers from Winston Real Estate Holdings, Charles Winston's primary company. From there, the money moved through a labyrinth of entities before smaller sums appeared in accounts controlled by Evergreen Consulting, a company with no employees, no office, and no apparent business purpose beyond receiving monthly payments. The breakthrough came when Marcus discovered that Evergreen Consulting's corporate registration listed Carol Harmon, Judge Wallace Harmon's wife, as its sole officer. The judge himself didn't appear on any paperwork, but the connection was clear. Over the past 3 years, nearly $2 million had filtered from Pinnacle to Evergreen in monthly installments that increased whenever Judge Harmon ruled favorably in cases involving Pinnacle or its affiliated companies. "Got you," Marcus muttered as he compiled the financial records, creating charts showing the timing of payments corresponding with court decisions. It wasn't just Oakwood Heights. Similar patterns of fraudulent property seizures and gentrification had occurred in 3 other historically black neighborhoods in Westlake City, each following the same playbook: falsified documents, legal intimidation, and evictions approved by Judge Harmon. Marcus's next challenge was identifying who had created the fraudulent mortgage transfer documents. The paperwork submitted to the county recorder's office was professionally executed, with forged signatures that would fool most observers. After consulting with an FBI document analyst, Marcus focused on subtle patterns in the forgeries that suggested a professional touch. Cross-referencing known document forgers with connections to Westlake City led him to Albert Michaels, a former legal secretary with a record of petty fraud who had suddenly purchased an expensive condominium 6 months earlier. Locating Michaels wasn't difficult, but approaching him would be tricky. Marcus needed to question him without revealing his FBI connection or tipping off Pinnacle that someone was investigating their operation. He settled on posing as a potential client, contacting Michaels through an encrypted messaging app commonly used in certain criminal circles. Their meeting was set for the following evening at a bar on the outskirts of town. Marcus arrived early, selecting a booth with a view of both entrances and minimal exposure to security cameras. Michaels walked in 30 minutes late, a nervous man with thinning hair and expensive clothes that didn't quite fit his frame, suggesting recent wealth, but Marcus never got the chance to question him. As he watched, Michaels received a text message, glanced around frantically, and rushed out of the bar. Marcus followed at a distance, tracking him to his apartment building. He considered approaching directly but decided to wait until morning, when Michaels might be less suspicious. The decision haunted him when he learned the next day that Albert Michaels had been found dead in his apartment, an apparent suicide by hanging. The police report noted a typed suicide note expressing remorse for unspecified professional misconduct and financial troubles despite his recent purchases. No autopsy was ordered due to the clear circumstances of death. Marcus immediately recognized the hallmarks of a staged suicide. The timing was too convenient, the note too vague, and the lack of autopsy too convenient for Pinnacle and their allies. He was certain Michaels had been murdered to eliminate a potential witness, but proving it would be nearly impossible without official FBI involvement. Meanwhile, Eleanor faced escalating intimidation. Police cruisers parked outside her home at all hours, officers taking photographs of everyone who visited her. When she went grocery shopping, store employees who had known her for decades suddenly refused to serve her, admitting later they had been threatened with health code violations if they continued to do business with certain troublemakers. Community support began to waver as the pressure increased. Several neighbors who had initially joined the human chain protecting Eleanor's home stopped participating, citing threats to their jobs or children's safety. Even Reverend Turner received a visit from tax auditors the day after he spoke at a rally supporting Eleanor. "They're isolating her," Marcus told Zoe during a brief, carefully arranged meeting in a park 3 miles from Eleanor's neighborhood. "It's a classic intimidation strategy. Cut the target off from support systems, make them feel alone and hopeless." "She's stronger than they realize," Zoe replied, though worry lined her face. "But we're running out of time. The court hearing is in 3 days, and Judge Harmon has made it clear he intends to rule against her regardless of evidence." Marcus faced a crucial decision: continue gathering evidence methodically, but risk his mother losing her home, or reveal himself and trigger federal intervention based on what he had already uncovered. The evidence was substantial but not yet ironclad. Without Michaels's testimony connecting the forged documents directly to Pinnacle's leadership, there were still gaps that a good defense attorney could exploit. 2 more days, he decided. "I need 2 more days to secure enough evidence that even Judge Harmon's friends can't make it disappear." What he didn't know was that those 2 days would bring even greater challenges than he anticipated, as the conspiracy's reach extended further than anyone had imagined. As the final days before the hearing approached, Eleanor found herself increasingly isolated. Neighbors who had stood with her initially now crossed the street to avoid speaking with her. The community center where they had held meetings suddenly closed for emergency renovations. Even local businesses that had served the neighborhood for generations displayed right-to-refuse service signs when she entered. Most painful of all was Sunday morning, when Eleanor arrived at New Hope Baptist Church, where she had been a member for 53 years. She had taught Sunday school, organized food drives, and sung in the choir since she was a teenager. But as she approached her usual pew, Pastor Williams intercepted her with an uncomfortable expression. "Sister Eleanor," he said quietly, glancing at several well-dressed members of the church board who watched from the doorway. "Perhaps we could speak privately for a moment." In his office, Pastor Williams struggled to meet her eyes as he explained that certain influential members had expressed concerns about her divisive legal matters, creating tension in the congregation. "Just until this situation resolves," he suggested weakly, "perhaps you could take a break from choir duties and maybe worship at home for a few Sundays. For the sake of church unity." Eleanor sat perfectly still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her back straight as always. "Pastor, my husband is buried in the church cemetery. My son was baptized at that altar. I have tithed faithfully every Sunday of my adult life." Her voice remained gentle but firm. "If New Hope has no place for me now, then perhaps it was never my home at all." She walked out with dignity, her Sunday hat perfectly straight, nodding politely to stunned congregants as she passed. Only when she reached her car did she allow a single tear to fall, quickly brushed away as she drove home alone. Marcus witnessed his mother's isolation from afar, his rage building with each new indignity she suffered. He channeled that anger into his investigation, working through the night to compile his evidence into a format that would meet FBI standards for intervention. The next morning, he took his greatest risk yet, traveling to Atlanta to meet with FBI Regional Director Sandra Phillips. Director Phillips reviewed his evidence with a practiced neutral expression, occasionally asking sharp questions that tested the thoroughness of his work. When she finally looked up from the files, her assessment was direct. "This is compelling, Agent Mitchell, but still circumstantial in key areas. The financial connections are strong, but without testimony linking the judge directly to knowledge of the fraud, defense attorneys will claim his wife's business dealings were separate from his judicial decisions. People are losing their homes right now," Marcus argued. "My mother could be evicted in 48 hours. Director Phillips raised an eyebrow. "Your mother? You didn't mention a personal connection." Marcus realized his mistake too late. "I should have disclosed that immediately. I apologize for the oversight." "This changes things significantly, Agent Mitchell. You're personally involved, which compromises your objectivity and potentially any evidence you've gathered." After a tense discussion, they reached a compromise. The FBI would continue investigating independently, but would not intervene before Eleanor's hearing unless Marcus provided definitive evidence of criminal conspiracy. His unauthorized use of FBI resources would be overlooked given the apparent civil rights violations, but he was officially on leave until the case concluded. As Marcus drove back to Westlake City, Zoe was experiencing a victory of her own. Through exhaustive legal research, she had discovered 3 precedent cases in which courts had invalidated similar fraudulent property transfers, including one from the state Supreme Court that had language nearly identical to Eleanor's situation. The cases weren't widely known, having been decided before digital cataloging became standard, but they provided strong legal ground for their arguments. Her satisfaction was short-lived. That evening, as she drove home from her office, her car suddenly became difficult to control. The vehicle pulled sharply to the right, nearly sending her into a concrete barrier before she managed to bring it to a stop on the shoulder. The mechanic who examined her car found evidence of tampering with the brake lines. When she filed a police report, the officer dismissively concluded there was no evidence of foul play, despite the mechanic's written statement. The incident confirmed what Marcus already knew. The opposition was growing desperate, and therefore more dangerous. Judge Harmon had scheduled the emergency hearing with minimal notice, clearly attempting to catch Eleanor's team unprepared. The accelerated timeline, the escalating intimidation, the attempt on Zoe's life all pointed to an operation unraveling. Under scrutiny. People were making mistakes which created both opportunity and danger. Local reporter Aisha Johnson had begun asking questions after covering the human chain around Eleanor's home. Her initial story had been edited by station management to downplay the community support, but she had continued investigating independently. She reached out to Zoe requesting an interview with Eleanor for a potential investigative piece. Marcus intercepted the message through his surveillance of Zoe's communications, recognizing both opportunity and risk. Media attention could provide protection through visibility, but also might provoke more aggressive retaliation. After careful consideration, he decided not to interfere, trusting his mother's judgment if she chose to speak with the reporter. On the evening before the hearing, Marcus made his final decision. He would attend in disguise, prepared to reveal himself as an FBI agent if Judge Harmon ruled against his mother. The evidence he had gathered might not be enough for a conviction yet, but it would be sufficient to trigger a formal investigation that would temporarily halt any eviction proceedings. He didn't tell Eleanor about his plan. If she knew he was risking his career to protect her, she would refuse to let him make that sacrifice. His mother had spent her life protecting others. Tomorrow, it would be his turn to protect her. Would you risk your career to fight injustice affecting your family? Comment number 1, if you believe Marcus should reveal himself as an FBI agent in court. Number 2, if you think he should continue gathering evidence without exposing his identity. Or number 3, if you think there's another approach he should consider. If you've ever witnessed corruption in your community and wished someone would take a stand, hit that like button and subscribe to see more stories about everyday heroes fighting against systemic injustice. What will happen when Eleanor finally faces Judge Harmon in court? Will Marcus's evidence be enough to stop the powerful forces aligned against his mother? And how far will Charles Winston go to silence those standing in the way of his profitable development plans? The Westlake County Courthouse stood imposingly in the center of downtown, its classical columns and stone steps designed to convey authority and permanence. On the morning of the hearing, Eleanor Mitchell arrived early, dressed in a navy blue suit that had been her courtroom attire during 30 years of nursing expert testimony. Her silver hair was styled in a neat bun, pearl earrings catching the light as she climbed the steps with dignified determination, Zoe Taylor at her side. Carrying a briefcase filled with documentation, the atmosphere inside was immediately hostile. Court officers who typically greeted regular visitors with polite nods barely acknowledged Eleanor's presence, directing her to the security line with curt gestures. One officer made a show of searching her purse extensively, removing items and examining them with exaggerated scrutiny, while others passed through with minimal inspection. "Stay calm, Mrs. Mitchell," Zoe whispered. "They're trying to rattle you before we even begin." The courtroom itself reinforced the power imbalance. Pinnacle Properties had assembled a team of 5 attorneys in expensive suits, their table, covered with neatly organized binders, and a sleek laptop displaying presentation materials. Charles Winston sat confidently behind them, exchanging familiar nods with several court officials. By contrast, Zoe sat alone beside Eleanor at the plaintiff's table, their modest stack of documents dwarfed by the opposition's display. Marcus slipped in just as proceedings began, taking a seat in the back row. He wore glasses, a slightly different hairstyle and business attire that helped him blend in with other observers. From his position, he could see his mother's straight back, her hands folded calmly on the table before her. Pride swelled in his chest at her composure, despite everything she had endured. Judge Harmon entered, and the familiar call to rise echoed through the room. The judge's cold eyes swept over the assembled crowd, lingering briefly on the few community members who had dared to attend in support of Eleanor. He took his seat with an air of impatience, as though the proceedings were a minor inconvenience. In his busy day, "We're here in the matter of Mitchell versus Pinnacle Properties regarding disputed property ownership," he announced, shuffling papers without looking up. "Given the emergency nature of this hearing and limited court time, I'll be strictly controlling presentations. Ms. Taylor, you have 15 minutes to present your client's case." Zoe stood, her expression betraying nothing of the unfairness of allocating just 15 minutes for a case of this complexity. "Your Honor, we have extensive documentation demonstrating that Mrs. Mitchell's mortgage was fully satisfied 5 years ago, making the alleged transfer to Pinnacle Properties fraudulent on its face." She barely managed 2 sentences before Judge Harmon interrupted. "Counselor, please stick to admissible evidence. Allegations of fraud are serious and require substantial proof." This pattern continued throughout Zoe's presentation. Each time she attempted to introduce key evidence, the judge interrupted with procedural objections or dismissive comments. When she tried to reference similar cases affecting other Oakwood Heights residents to establish a pattern, Judge Harmon cut her off sharply. "This hearing concerns only your client's specific property. Other cases are irrelevant and potentially prejudicial." Meanwhile, Pinnacle's lead attorney, Richard Donovan, nodded approvingly at each interruption. The contrast became even more stark when Donovan rose to present Pinnacle's side. Judge Harmon listened attentively, asking clarifying questions that allowed Donovan to expand on his points. When Donovan offered hearsay evidence about conversations with bank officials not present in court, the judge accepted it without objection. Charles Winston took the stand with practiced confidence, describing how Pinnacle had legally acquired Eleanor's mortgage through standard business channels. His testimony was clearly rehearsed, with convenient gaps in his knowledge about specifics of the transaction. "To the best of my understanding, Mrs. Mitchell's mortgage was part of a portfolio acquired from First National Bank," Winston testified smoothly. "Our records indicate she failed to maintain payments after her husband's passing, unfortunately necessitating this action." Zoe's objection that these statements contradicted the documented evidence was overruled without explanation. When she attempted to cross-examine Winston about Pinnacle's pattern of targeting elderly black homeowners, Judge Harmon sustained objections, before Winston could even answer. Finally, Eleanor took the stand. Despite the hostile environment, she spoke with clarity and dignity about her home, her life with Robert, and the final mortgage payment they had celebrated together. She described finding the documentation, her visit to the bank, and the escalating intimidation she had faced. "Robert and I worked our entire lives to own our home outright," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. "We wanted something to leave to our son, something that showed what we could accomplish despite all the obstacles placed in our way. That home contains 40 years of memories. It's not just property to me." Something in her sincerity seemed to reach even the most indifferent observers. Several people in the gallery nodded in recognition of a universal truth about home and belonging. For a brief moment, the humanity of the situation broke through the clinical legal proceedings. Judge Harmon appeared momentarily discomfited by the impact of Eleanor's testimony and quickly called for a 15-minute recess. As he stood to leave the bench, he made brief eye contact with Charles Winston, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. The two men disappeared into the judge's chambers, while court officers cleared the room for the break. Marcus slipped out quietly, positioning himself in the hallway where he could observe who entered or exited the judge's chambers. Using a small, directional microphone concealed in his jacket pocket, he recorded the muffled conversation taking place behind the closed door. The words weren't entirely clear, but the conspiratorial tone was unmistakable. Eleanor stood alone by a window during the recess, declining Zoe's suggestion that they discuss strategy. "Some matters are in God's hands now," she said simply. "I've told my truth, that's all I can do." As the bailiff called everyone back into the courtroom, Marcus caught his mother's eye briefly. Though he knew she couldn't recognize him in his disguise, something in her expression suggested a mother's intuition. She straightened her shoulders even more, returning to face whatever came next with renewed resolve. When Judge Harmon returned from recess, his demeanor had subtly shifted. The pretense of impartiality had thinned, replaced by barely concealed contempt as he gestured for Pinnacle's attorney to continue. Richard Donovan rose with a predatory smile, approaching Eleanor, who had resumed her seat at the plaintiff's table. "Mrs. Mitchell, is it possible that in your grief over your husband's passing, you might have confused some financial matters?" Donovan began, his tone falsely sympathetic. Elderly people often struggle with complex transactions after losing a spouse who handled such affairs. Zoe shot to her feet. "Objection! Argumentative and assumes facts not in evidence. Mrs. Mitchell has clearly testified that she and her husband managed their finances jointly." "Overruled," Judge Harmon said dismissively. "The witness's mental state and capacity to recall financial details is relevant to these proceedings." This set the tone for what followed. Donovan subjected Eleanor to a brutal cross-examination that attacked not just her recollection, but her character. He questioned her education, suggested she had misunderstood basic financial concepts, and repeatedly referred to her age as though it automatically undermined her credibility. Throughout it all, Eleanor maintained her composure. When Donovan suggested she might be confused about which bills were paid, she calmly recited from memory the date, check number, and exact amount of their final mortgage payment. When he questioned whether she might have signed papers, she didn't understand. She reminded him she had reviewed medical consent forms professionally for 30 years as a nurse. "Mr. Donovan," she said with quiet dignity when he pressed particularly hard, "I may be 60 years old, but my mind is clear, my memory is sound, and I know when something that belongs to me is being taken unjustly." From his seat, Marcus could see the courtroom observers responding to his mother's steadfast testimony. Even one of the court reporters had stopped typing momentarily, moved by Eleanor's words. Charles Winston leaned forward to whisper urgently to Donovan, who nodded, and abruptly changed tactics. "Your Honor, we'd like to call a surprise witness whose testimony has just become relevant based on Mrs. Mitchell's claims." Judge Harmon smiled thinly. "The court will allow it, given the emergency nature of these proceedings." Zoe objected vigorously. "Your Honor, introducing a surprise witness without proper notice violates basic discovery rules. We've had no opportunity to review their testimony or prepare cross-examination." Given the accelerated timeline, Ms. Taylor, certain procedural flexibilities are necessary, Judge Harmon replied. Your objection is noted and overruled. The witness who entered was a thin man with shifty eyes and a nervous demeanor that he attempted to mask with an overly confident stride. He introduced himself as Gregory Miller, a financial consultant who claimed to have met with Eleanor and Robert Mitchell 3 years ago. For they were exploring options to access equity in their home, Miller testified smoothly. Mrs. Mitchell specifically mentioned wanting to sell the property but retain living rights until her passing. It was a blatant lie. Eleanor had never seen this man before, and Robert had been deceased for longer than 3 years. Moreover, Marcus recognized the witness immediately as Thomas Reed, a known associate of fraudulent real estate schemes in 3 states. Reed had changed his appearance slightly, but his distinctive speech pattern and nervous habit of touching his left ear when lying were unmistakable. Zoe, though not recognizing the witness's true identity, skillfully dismantled his testimony. Through cross-examination, she established that he had no documentation of these alleged meetings, couldn't describe the interior of the Mitchell home he had supposedly visited multiple times, and was unable to provide basic details about Robert Mitchell that anyone who had actually met him would know. "And where exactly did these meetings take place, Mr. Miller?" Zoe asked. "In their living room," he answered confidently. "Could you describe the color of their living room walls?" His confidence faltered. White? Or maybe beige? And the large distinctive item hanging on the main wall? A family portrait." Zoe smiled slightly. "The Mitchell's living room is painted sage green, and they have a 3-foot carved wooden cross that Mr. Mitchell made himself on the main wall. It's the first thing anyone notices when entering the room." Reed's testimony crumbled further, under Zoe's precise questioning, but Judge Harmon intervened before the damage became too severe. "We've spent enough time on this witness," he announced. "Ms. Taylor, conclude your cross-examination." "One final question," Zoe said, turning back to Reed. "What is your relationship with Pinnacle Properties or Charles Winston?" "Objection!" Donovan shouted. "Irrelevant and assumes facts not in evidence." "Sustained," Judge Harmon ruled immediately. "The witness is excused." As Reed hurried from the courtroom, Marcus discreetly photographed him with a pen camera, planning to forward his real identity to Zoe as soon as possible. But before he could act, Judge Harmon made a surprising announcement. "I believe I've heard sufficient testimony to make a ruling in this matter," he said, ignoring Zoe's protest that she had additional witnesses and evidence to present. "Given the time-sensitive nature of this dispute and the court's busy calendar, I'll issue my decision immediately." The abrupt move to judgment confirmed what Marcus already knew. The entire proceeding had been orchestrated from the beginning. Judge Harmon had no intention of allowing a fair hearing, regardless of the evidence presented. Have you ever witnessed someone stand firm in their truth despite overwhelming pressure to back down? Comment number 1 if you admire Eleanor's dignity under such aggressive questioning. Number 2 if you think Zoe should have objected even more strongly to the procedural violations. Or number 3 if you believe Marcus should have intervened immediately when the false witness appeared. Hit that like button if you've ever felt that power and privilege can distort justice, and subscribe to see more stories that expose how courage can challenge corrupt systems. What devastating ruling will Judge Harmon deliver? Will Marcus finally reveal his identity to stop this mockery of justice? And what evidence did his hidden microphone capture during that secret meeting between the judge and Charles Winston? Judge Wallace Harmon adjusted his robes and stared down at Eleanor with the cold detachment of a man who had already decided her fate long before she entered his courtroom. The gallery fell silent as he prepared to deliver his ruling. The tension, palpable as everyone present, sensed the weight of what was to come. "In the matter of Mitchell versus Pinnacle Properties," he began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of 20 years on the bench, "this court finds in favor of the defendant, Pinnacle Properties." Eleanor sat perfectly still, her expression revealing nothing as Judge Harmon continued his ruling, each word another blow against justice. "The plaintiff has failed to provide sufficient documentation to support her claim of mortgage satisfaction. While Mrs. Mitchell has presented what she believes to be evidence of payment, The court finds these materials inadequate when weighed against the properly filed transfer documents submitted by Pinnacle Properties. Zoe began writing rapidly, documenting each legally questionable statement for the appeal she already knew would be necessary. Judge Harmon continued, his ruling growing more punitive with each sentence. Furthermore, the court finds Mrs. Mitchell's recollection of events to be inconsistent and potentially compromised by her advanced age and the emotional distress of widowhood. Mr. Miller's testimony suggests she may have entered into agreements she now fails to recall. The coded racism and sexism in his words were barely disguised. The reference to advanced age, despite Eleanor's obvious mental acuity, the dismissal of her documentation as inadequate while accepting Pinnacle's clearly suspicious paperwork, the implication that as a widow she was incapable of understanding her own financial affairs, all of it reflected biases that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with power. Therefore, this court upholds Pinnacle Properties' right to immediate possession of the property at 1432 Magnolia Street. Mrs. Mitchell is ordered to vacate the premises within 48 hours and to pay Pinnacle Properties' legal fees in the amount of $15,000. Gasps rose from the few community supporters present. The ruling was not just unjust, but unusually punitive, clearly designed to crush Eleanor financially as well as deprive her of her home. Forcing her to pay the opposition's legal fees was a rarely applied measure typically reserved for frivolous lawsuits, not legitimate disputes with substantial evidence. Eleanor finally showed emotion, a single tear tracking down her cheek before she wiped it away with dignified composure. Beside her, Zoe looked pale with shock despite having anticipated an unfavorable ruling. Even she hadn't expected such a blatantly biased decision or the vindictive financial penalty. "Your Honor," Zoe said, rising to her feet, "we intend to appeal this ruling immediately on multiple grounds, including procedural irregularities and clear evidence that was improperly excluded." Judge Harmon's smile was thin and cold. "You're welcome to pursue that avenue, Ms. Taylor. However, this court further orders that any appeal must be accompanied by a security bond equal to the assessed value of the property, to be posted within 24 hours. This additional requirement was a devastating blow. The bond would amount to hundreds of thousands of dollars, an impossible sum for Eleanor to produce on such short notice. It was another calculated move to block her access to justice, effectively eliminating her right to appeal, despite the obvious grounds for challenging the ruling. As the courtroom began to empty, Charles Winston walked past Eleanor, pausing just long enough to whisper, "Know your place," loud enough for her to hear but not for others to notice. The smirk on his face revealed his complete confidence in his victory and the system that protected men like him. The few community members who had attended approached Eleanor with sympathetic touches and whispered encouragements. But their support felt hollow against the magnitude of what she had just lost. 40 years of memories, the home where she and Robert had raised their son, the security of ownership in her retirement years, all stripped away by a corrupt judge in service to wealthy developers. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around Zoe and Eleanor. Most asked superficial questions that accepted the ruling's legitimacy, but Aisha Johnson from the local station pushed harder. "Mrs. Mitchell, many legal observers would find this ruling unusual given the evidence you presented. Do you believe other factors influenced the judge's decision?" Before Eleanor could answer, Zoe intervened professionally. "We're obviously disappointed with today's outcome and are exploring all available options to challenge what we believe is a gravely unjust decision. The evidence clearly showed that Mrs. Mitchell's mortgage was fully satisfied years ago, making the alleged transfer to Pinnacle Properties fraudulent." As they moved toward Zoe's car, Eleanor finally spoke to the reporters, her voice steady, despite her evident exhaustion. "My husband and I believed in this country's promise of equal justice under law. Today I saw that some people still have to fight harder than others for that promise to be kept. But I want to tell Mr. Winston and Judge Harmon that this isn't over. My parents and grandparents faced worse than this and never surrendered their dignity. Neither will I." Back in the now empty courtroom, Marcus remained seated, his mind racing as he processed what he had witnessed. The ruling was even worse than he had anticipated, revealing not just bias, but a coordinated effort to ensure Eleanor had no recourse. The judge had created a perfect trap, an unjust ruling coupled with an impossible barrier to appeal. The time for cautious investigation had ended. Marcus had substantial evidence of corruption, bias, and civil rights violations, but not enough to guarantee swift intervention through official channels. Appeals would take months or years, while his mother had just 48 hours before. She would be forcibly removed from her home. He made his decision. Tomorrow he would return to this courtroom for the final eviction hearing. When Judge Harmon attempted to formalize Eleanor's removal from her home, Marcus would reveal himself and present his evidence publicly. It would likely end his undercover career with the FBI, possibly his entire career in law enforcement, but some principles mattered more than professional advancement. As Marcus left the courthouse, he noticed Judge Harmon and Charles Winston entering a black SUV together, abandoning even the pretense of separation between them now that the ruling had been delivered. Their confidence in their impunity was so complete that they no longer bothered to hide their alliance. That confidence, Marcus decided, would be their downfall. Men who believed themselves untouchable made mistakes, and he would be there to ensure those mistakes carried consequences. The courtroom for the final eviction hearing was nearly empty compared to the previous day. Most of Eleanor's supporters had given up hope after Judge Harmon's devastating ruling, believing further resistance futile. Only Zoe, Eleanor, and a handful of determined community elders occupied the plaintiff's section, their expressions solemn but resolute. Eleanor sat with perfect posture, despite having barely slept, her hands folded neatly on the table before her. She had spent the night, packing photo albums and family mementos, the treasures that couldn't be replaced if the eviction proceeded. The larger furniture and household items would likely be lost. There was nowhere to move them on such short notice, and no money for storage after the punitive legal fees Judge Harmon had imposed. Charles Winston wasn't present this time, having sent a junior attorney to handle what was considered a mere formality. Judge Harmon entered with the same cold efficiency as the previous day, barely acknowledging the people whose lives he was destroying with his signature. "We're here to formalize the eviction order for the property at 1432 Magnolia Street," he announced, shuffling papers impatiently. "Counsel, have the required forms been prepared?" Pinnacle's attorney stood. "Yes, Your Honor, we've prepared the final order as directed." Judge Harmon nodded. "Very well. Ms. Taylor, does your client understand she must vacate the premises by 5 p.m. today?" Zoe rose, her expression professional despite her simmering anger. "Your Honor, we're still attempting to secure a bond for appeal. We request a 72-hour extension to—" "Request denied," Judge Harmon interrupted curtly. "The court's ruling was clear. Now, if there are no other matters to address, I'll sign the final order. And there is another matter. Your Honor." The authoritative voice from the back of the courtroom caused everyone to turn. Marcus Mitchell stood, removing the glasses that had been part of his disguise, and walking purposefully toward the front of the courtroom. "Who are you, and what business do you have interrupting these proceedings?" Judge Harmon demanded, his face flushing with anger at the unexpected intervention. Marcus reached inside his jacket and withdrew his FBI credentials, holding them up for the court to see. "Special Agent Marcus Mitchell, Federal Bureau of Investigation. This proceeding is now part of an ongoing federal investigation into judicial corruption, mortgage fraud, and civil rights violations in Westlake City." The courtroom erupted in murmurs of shock. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth as she recognized her son beneath the altered appearance, understanding instantly why he had kept his presence secret. "Marcus," she whispered, tears finally breaking through her composed exterior. Judge Harmon's face had drained of color, but he quickly attempted to reassert control. "This is highly irregular and inappropriate, Agent Mitchell. If the FBI has concerns, there are proper channels. The FBI has evidence that you, Judge Wallace Harmon, have received substantial kickbacks from Pinnacle Properties through Shell C. Companies controlled by your wife in exchange for favorable rulings in cases involving property in historically black neighborhoods. This is outrageous," Judge Harmon sputtered, banging his gavel. "Bailiff, remove this man from my courtroom. Immediately, the bailiff hesitated, uncertain about confronting a federal agent displaying official credentials. Taking advantage of the moment, Marcus continued, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent courtroom. "I have here a federal warrant authorizing investigation of judicial misconduct, signed by Judge Claudia Washington of the Eastern District Federal Court." He held up the document. "Additionally, I have evidence that the witness who testified yesterday as Gregory Miller is actually Thomas Reed, a known associate of fraudulent real estate operations with outstanding warrants in 3 states." As if on cue, the courtroom doors opened and 4 FBI agents in suits entered, positioning themselves strategically around the room. Judge Harmon's face contorted with rage and fear as he realized the extent of what was happening. This proceeding, "Here's adjourned," he shouted, attempting to flee to his chambers. "Judge Harmon, you don't want to add evading federal officers to the charges you're facing," Marcus warned calmly. At that moment, Charles Winston burst into the courtroom, having apparently been alerted by his junior attorney. Seeing the FBI agents, he immediately turned to leave, only to find 2 more agents blocking the exit. "Mr. Winston, please remain. We have questions regarding your company's mortgage documentation practices," one agent announced. Winston's practiced confidence crumbled. "I want my attorney present for any questioning. This is harassment based on the unfounded accusations of a disgruntled property owner." Marcus approached the bench, removing a small recording device from his pocket. "Your Honor, perhaps you'd like to explain this conversation you had with Mr. Winston during yesterday's recess." He pressed play and Judge Harmon's voice filled the courtroom. "Don't worry, Charles, I don't care what documentation the old lady has. This ends today, and you'll have the property by tomorrow. Just make sure that offshore transfer happens." "As discussed." Winston's voice replied, "It's already arranged, same account as the Riverdale properties. She doesn't stand a chance." The color drained entirely from Judge Harmon's face as he realized the extent of the evidence against him. "That recording was obtained illegally. It's inadmissible." "Actually," Marcus corrected, "it was obtained under a federal surveillance warrant as part of an ongoing corruption investigation. Perfectly admissible." As FBI agents approached Judge Harmon and Charles Winston, the court clerk and bailiff stepped away, wanting no association with what was clearly a major federal case. Several court officials who had been complicit in the judge's activities suddenly found urgent business elsewhere, slipping out of side doors. "Judge Wallace Harmon, you're being detained for questioning regarding allegations of judicial corruption, accepting bribes, and civil rights violations," announced the lead FBI agent, a stern woman with graying hair at her temples. Simultaneously, another agent approached Winston. "Charles Winston, you're being detained for questioning regarding mortgage fraud, conspiracy, witness tampering, and civil rights violations." As they were led away, reporter Aisha Johnson slipped into the courtroom, capturing the scene on her phone despite a bailiff's half-hearted attempt to stop her. The story would lead the evening news and eventually national broadcasts as the extent of the corruption became public. Eleanor finally rose from her seat, approaching her son with tears streaming down her face. "Marcus, you shouldn't have risked your career for me." Marcus embraced his mother tightly. "Some things matter more than careers, Mom. Dad taught me that. This was never just about your house. It's about justice for everyone they've hurt." As mother and son embraced, Zoe began collecting the court documents, a determined smile replacing her earlier despair. "This changes everything. We'll need to file emergency motions to invalidate all of Judge Harmon's rulings in similar cases." For the first time in months, hope filled the space where fear had reigned. But as Marcus well knew, powerful men rarely surrendered without a fierce counterattack. The victory, sweet as it was, marked only the beginning of an even more dangerous battle. News of Judge Harmon's detainment and the FBI investigation into Pinnacle Properties spread through Westlake City with extraordinary speed. By evening, all local stations had interrupted regular programming for special reports, and national news organizations were sending correspondents to cover what was being described as one of the most blatant cases of judicial corruption and housing discrimination in recent memory. Eleanor became an overnight symbol of resistance against gentrification and corruption. Her dignified presence and articulate interviews provided a compelling human face to the complex issues of housing discrimination and judicial misconduct. Social media filled with supportive messages and calls for justice, many using the hashtag #IStandWithEleanor, that began trending nationally by nightfall. The widespread attention should have offered protection. Instead, it provoked a coordinated counterattack from those whose power and profits were threatened by the exposure. Mayor Franklin called an emergency press conference on the steps of City Hall, surrounded by business leaders and political allies. Dressed immaculately and projecting calm authority, he delivered a carefully crafted message that reframed the entire situation. "What we're witnessing is an unprecedented federal overreach into local governance," the mayor declared, his voice resonating with practiced indignation. "While we respect the FBI's role in investigating genuine criminal activity, this intervention appears politically motivated and based on flimsy evidence provided by individuals with personal grievances." Without directly defending Judge Harmon or Pinnacle Properties, Mayor Franklin shifted the narrative to one of outside interference versus local values. Westlake City has always managed its own affairs according to the wishes of its citizens. This heavy-handed federal intervention threatens the economic revitalization that has brought jobs and prosperity to our community. The subtext was clear to anyone familiar with the coded language often used to defend discriminatory practices. The economic revitalization had come at the expense of black homeowners, and the wishes of citizens referred only to wealthy, white constituents whose interests aligned with developers. The counterattack escalated when Police Chief Reynolds mobilized officers to break up a peaceful demonstration supporting Eleanor and other affected homeowners. Despite the protesters having proper permits, police in riot gear surrounded them, citing public safety concerns and reports of potential violence that no witnesses could corroborate. 23 protesters were arrested, including Reverend Turner and several elderly residents of Oakwood Heights who had come to show solidarity. The police department issued a statement claiming the demonstrators had become hostile and uncooperative, despite video evidence showing entirely peaceful behavior before the police intervention. Marcus discovered that his own position was suddenly vulnerable when his FBI supervisor called with troubling news. "Mitchell, there's pressure coming from above to recall you to Washington," she explained tensely. "Someone with serious influence has suggested your investigation was improperly motivated by personal connections. They're questioning every piece of evidence you've gathered." Though his supervisor assured him she was fighting the interference, Marcus understood the implications. The corruption in Westlake City had tendrils reaching into federal levels, with powerful figures working to discredit the investigation before it could expose the full network of complicity. The threats against Eleanor escalated dramatically that night, as she sat in her living room with Zoe reviewing documentation for other affected homeowners. The quiet was shattered by the sound of gunshots. 3 bullets pierced the front window, embedding themselves in the wall inches from where Eleanor had been sitting moments earlier. The police response was tellingly delayed, with officers arriving nearly 40 minutes after multiple 911 calls. Their cursory investigation concluded it was likely random gunfire rather than a targeted attack, despite the precision of the shots and witnesses reporting a vehicle matching one frequently seen outside Pinnacle Properties offices. The FBI immediately placed Eleanor in protective custody, moving her to a secure location outside Westlake City. As agents escorted her from her home, she paused to touch the doorframe one last time, uncertain if she would ever return. "Your father built this house," she told Marcus softly. "He said every family deserves a place where they can be safe and proud. I never thought I'd have to leave it like this." Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "This isn't over, Mom. I promise you that." The situation gained unexpected momentum when Judge Melissa Diaz from the neighboring federal district took notice of the case. Known for her fierce independence and unwavering commitment to constitutional principles, Judge Diaz issued an emergency stay on all evictions related to Pinnacle Properties pending federal review, effectively freezing Winston's entire operation. This intervention should have provided breathing room for the investigation to proceed methodically. Instead, it triggered the most dangerous phase of the counterattack. Mayor Franklin and Police Chief Reynolds mobilized political support from state-level officials, including 2 senators and the governor's office. Suddenly, the narrative in certain media outlets shifted to portray the investigation as federal overreach threatening states' rights and local economic development. From his temporary detention, Charles Winston made a series of calls to contacts whose identities remained obscured. Marcus's surveillance team detected the communications but couldn't identify the recipients due to sophisticated encryption. Whatever Winston had set in motion, it involved people with resources and technology far beyond a typical real estate developer's connections. Within hours of those calls, Eleanor's bank accounts were frozen due to suspicious activity flagged by automated systems. Zoe Taylor received notice that she was under investigation by the State Bar Association for alleged ethics violations. The community center in Oakwood Heights, which had served as a meeting place for affected homeowners, received an emergency condemnation order citing previously undetected structural issues. Each attack seemed unrelated on the surface, but formed part of a coordinated effort to isolate, intimidate, and silence everyone connected to the case. The message was clear: powerful interests would not surrender their profitable operations without deploying every weapon in their considerable arsenal. Marcus recognized the pattern from previous investigations into organized crime and corruption. When illegal operations felt threatened, they typically responded first with intimidation, then with bureaucratic obstruction using compromised officials, and finally, when those measures failed, with direct violence. The escalating threats convinced Marcus that they were dealing with something far larger than one corrupt judge and an unscrupulous developer. The speed and coordination of the counterattack, the high-level interference, and the sophisticated methods employed all suggested a network extending into state government and possibly federal agencies. As he reviewed the evidence with his FBI colleagues in a secure location, Marcus came to a sobering conclusion. "This isn't just about gentrification or housing discrimination," he told them. "I think we've stumbled onto a money laundering operation using real estate development as cover. The properties in these historically black neighborhoods aren't just profitable development opportunities, they're vehicles for cleaning money from other illegal operations." The theory explained the ferocity of the response and the high-level protection Winston seemed to enjoy. It also meant that everyone involved in exposing the scheme was in significantly greater danger than they had initially realized. What had begun as one widow's fight to save her home had revealed a criminal enterprise with potential connections to public officials throughout the state. As Marcus developed a strategy to protect his mother and pursue the widening investigation, he received an encrypted message from an unknown source. "Courthouse Plaza, midnight. Come alone if you want the proof that connects it all." The message concluded with a code phrase from his first FBI assignment, one that only someone with access to classified personnel files would know. The message could be a genuine offer from a whistleblower or a trap set by those who wanted to eliminate the FBI agent who had exposed their operation. Either way, Marcus knew he would have to respond, as the information promised might be the key to protecting his mother and bringing down the entire corrupt network. The midnight meeting at Courthouse Plaza proved to be the turning point, though not in the way Marcus had anticipated. Approaching with extreme caution, he discovered not a single informant, but 3 separate individuals who had independently reached out, each with pieces of evidence they had been too frightened to share through official channels. A clerk from the county records office provided documentation showing systematic alterations to property records affecting more than 200 homes in historically black neighborhoods. A former Pinnacle Properties accountant brought financial records revealing connections between the development company and offshore accounts linked to known money laundering operations. Most surprisingly, a young officer from the Westlake Police Department delivered bodycam footage that had been ordered deleted, showing Police Chief Reynolds instructing officers to ignore crimes reported by certain residents who were, causing trouble for the mayor's development initiatives. Each whistleblower had reached their breaking point after seeing Eleanor Mitchell's courage in standing against the corruption. Her dignity and determination had awakened their dormant consciences, compelling them to act despite the personal risks. Armed with this compelling new evidence, Marcus contacted FBI Director Patricia Langford directly, bypassing the compromised channels that had been working to undermine his investigation. Director Langford, a career agent with a reputation for absolute integrity, reviewed the materials personally and made an unprecedented decision. "This goes beyond a local corruption case," she told Marcus during a secure video conference. "The evidence suggests systematic civil rights violations involving multiple government entities. I'm authorizing a full federal task force with resources from our public corruption, civil rights and financial crimes divisions." Within 24 hours, more than 30 FBI agents descended on Westlake City, executing simultaneous search warrants at City Hall, the police department, Pinnacle Properties offices, and the homes of Judge Harmon, Mayor Franklin, and Charles Tarfint C. Winston. The scale and coordination of the operation overwhelmed any possibility of interference or evidence destruction. The State Attorney General's office, initially reluctant to become involved, reversed course dramatically when presented, with evidence that implicated several state-level officials. Attorney General Michael Chen announced his office would join the federal investigation, appointing a special prosecutor with expertise in public corruption. The integrity of our justice system demands that no one, regardless of position or influence, be permitted to distort the law for personal gain, Chen stated at a hastily arranged press conference. The alleged abuses in Westlake City represent an intolerable perversion of legal authority that my office is committed to addressing with the full force of state law. As the investigation expanded, Eleanor remained in protective custody, receiving regular updates from Marcus about the rapidly unfolding events. She maintained her characteristic dignity, spending her days helping other displaced Oakwood Heights residents complete paperwork to potentially reclaim their homes. The final confrontation came not in a courtroom but in a parking garage, where Marcus intercepted an assassination attempt against his mother. Two men hired by associates of Charles Winston had tracked Eleanor's location through a compromised police officer. Marcus's training and quick reflexes prevented tragedy, resulting in the capture of hired killers whose subsequent plea deals provided crucial evidence connecting the conspiracy to figures at the state level who had been protecting the operation. The evidence proved devastating. Investigators discovered that Pinnacle Properties was indeed the public face of a sophisticated money laundering operation. The targeted acquisition of properties in historically black neighborhoods served multiple purposes: laundering illicit funds through construction and development projects, generating legitimate-appearing profits through gentrification, and providing kickbacks to officials who facilitated the scheme. Judge Harmon's rulings had been purchased not just with direct payments, but with substantial investments in businesses owned by his family members. Mayor Franklin had received campaign contributions laundered through shell companies, while Police Chief Reynolds had been promised a lucrative security consulting position upon retirement. The network extended to state representatives who had modified zoning laws to facilitate the operation and banking officials who had overlooked suspicious transactions. As arrests mounted and plea deals revealed ever more connections, the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. 27 officials from local government, law enforcement, and the judiciary were indicted on charges ranging from corruption and civil rights violations to money laundering and conspiracy. Charles Winston and 5 other executives from Pinnacle Properties faced multiple federal charges, with potential sentences exceeding 30 years. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit froze Pinnacle's assets, while Judge Diaz issued an emergency order invalidating all property transfers and evictions connected to the fraudulent scheme. A special master was appointed to oversee the restoration of properties to their rightful owners and the establishment of a victim compensation fund using seized assets. After 3 months in protective custody, Eleanor finally returned home to 1432 Magnolia Street. Neighbors lined the street as her car approached, applauding the woman whose courage had exposed the corruption that had threatened all their homes. The steps that had once been defaced with racist graffiti were now decorated with flowers and welcome home signs. Inside, the house had been untouched, preserved exactly as she had left it on that frightening night months earlier. Eleanor moved slowly through the rooms, touching familiar surfaces and reacquainting herself with the space that contained 40 years of memories. "Robert would be so proud of you," Zoe said softly, helping Eleanor unpack the few belongings she had taken into protective custody. "He would be proud of all of us," Eleanor replied. "He always said that justice doesn't just happen. People have to stand up for it, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." In the aftermath, Eleanor Mitchell became an unexpected but effective leader in the community's rebuilding efforts. With compensation from the seized assets of Pinnacle Properties and additional funds from civil rights settlements, she established the Oakwood Heights Housing Justice Coalition, helping families reclaim their homes and strengthening protections against future predatory practices. The Justice Department used the Westlake City case to launch a nationwide initiative investigating similar patterns of housing discrimination and corruption in other cities, with Eleanor serving as a consultant and spokesperson. Her experiences informed new federal guidelines for detecting and preventing mortgage fraud targeting vulnerable communities. Marcus Mitchell received the FBI Director's Award for his work in exposing the conspiracy, though he remained characteristically humble about his role. "The real courage was my mother's," he told colleagues. "She stood firm when it would have been easier to walk away, and that stand exposed corruption that had been hurting families for years." He accepted a transfer to the FBI's Civil Rights Division, where his experiences in Westlake City would inform his approach to similar cases nationwide. Though his undercover days were behind him, his new position offered different but equally meaningful opportunities to protect vulnerable communities from systemic abuses. 1 year after the initial courtroom confrontation, Eleanor and Marcus sat together on her front porch swing, watching neighborhood children play in yards that had nearly been lost to corrupt development. Families had returned to reclaim their homes. Community gardens had replaced vacant lots where speculative construction had been planned, and a new sense of solidarity united neighbors who had stood together against powerful forces. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been an FBI agent?" Marcus asked, watching the sunset paint the houses in warm, golden light. "If I hadn't had the resources to investigate?" Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering. "Justice might have taken longer, but I believe it would have come eventually. The truth has a way of surfacing, even when powerful people try to bury it, and there will always be good people willing to help it along." She patted his hand gently. "But I'm certainly grateful it was you who walked into that courtroom when we needed help the most." As darkness fell, lights came on in homes throughout Oakwood Heights, homes that remained in the hands of families who had earned them through decades of hard work and perseverance. Each glowing window represented not just a physical dwelling, but a beacon of justice preserved, a testament to the power of one person's refusal to accept injustice when confronted with overwhelming odds. For Eleanor Mitchell, that was legacy enough. This story reminds us that justice requires both courage and persistence, especially when facing systemic discrimination. Eleanor Mitchell's unwavering dignity in the face of corruption shows how individual determination can expose deep-rooted injustice. Her refusal to surrender her rightfully owned home became the catalyst that uncovered an entire network of corruption affecting hundreds of families. Meanwhile, Marcus demonstrates that sometimes fighting for what's right requires personal sacrifice and risk. True justice often depends on people willing to stand up against powerful interests, even when the odds seem overwhelming. The whistleblowers who eventually came forward highlight how one person's bravery can inspire others to find their own courage. Most importantly, this story teaches us that discrimination and corruption thrive in silence and secrecy. When communities unite and speak truth to power, even the most entrenched systems of injustice can be dismantled. Eleanor's final victory wasn't just about saving her home, it was about restoring dignity and justice to an entire community. Has there ever been a moment when you witnessed injustice and had to decide whether to speak up or stay silent? What would you have done in Eleanor's position when facing such overwhelming corruption? Comment below and share your thoughts on standing up against discrimination. If this story of courage against corruption resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about ordinary people fighting extraordinary battles. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that justice is worth fighting for, no matter how powerful the opposition. Thank you for joining us today. And remember, in the face of injustice, your voice matters. Sometimes the most powerful act of resistance is simply refusing to be silenced.